Wow, so it's great to be back here with you. You know, one of the fun things for me, in having spent a lot of time traveling around MCC churches, is to see the churches that are growing. And one of the ways I know that is all the new faces I see. Because I've been here many, many times over many years, and it's just so awesome to see so many new faces. So I look forward to meeting those of you that I have not had a chance to meet yet, and it's so great to see those of you who I do know and have had the good fortune to be with so many years. So I don't know about how the Pope's going to fare with Reverend Leah and Sarah Helen there to give him an earful. Don't you think that'll be a something? So I think we should pray for him. Maybe might be a better idea. So I'm so glad that they're away and being refreshed and getting some rest and having some fun. And I appreciate that you all are supporting them in doing that as a church. Trust me, there are pastors all around who wish their church would give them a minute to take a break. So good for you for doing that. So we're going to talk about Amazing Grace today. You've been working since the beginning of the year on this whole idea of wholeness, of looking at the balance of life and many of the different areas of life. And in worship, we're looking at the spiritual part of wholeness. So I want to suggest to you today that this hymn, Amazing Grace, or just the whole idea of grace, is something that is crucial to our spiritual life. And I want us to consider what the difference might be between grace and amazing grace. And so I want you to join me this morning to dig a little deeper about the topic of grace and what it has to do with our wholeness. So if you would pray with me, please. Holy One, we give you thanks that your Spirit is here with us, that it is moving, that it is around us and in us, and we are grateful to be standing here with your Spirit and on holy ground. So I ask now that the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts will rise up to meet you and that you will be pleased. May it be so in your many names. Amen. Amen. So for those of you who have met me before, you may know that I grew up in LA, Lower Alabama. You may also know that I am the daughter of a minister. He was a Southern Baptist minister for many years and then came out as a gay man and was an MCC pastor for a long time before he died. That's a whole other sermon, a whole other story. But when I was a kid and he was a Southern Baptist minister, we lived in a small South Alabama town, but it was considered the city. He was the pastor of the First Baptist Church of the City Church. But in South Alabama, the City Church is like a city of 2,500 people, most of whom went to the First Baptist Church. So in the summertime, the city pastor, my dad, was often invited to the country to do revivals. Well, when I was out of school during the summer, my mother worked, he often took me with him to these revivals. So he dragged me along to these country revivals. Many of you have no idea what that's like, so I want to share that with you. Okay? So a country revival, first of all, meant a whole week, Sunday to Sunday.
Yeah.
It also meant 2 times a day church at least. Okay? So because of that, the schedule was like this. We'd get up in the morning and we would go to church for a service at 10 a.m. Then we would go to someone's house in the congregation and eat lunch, or actually we called it dinner in South Alabama. Have lunch. Then we'd maybe rest, get a little nap. Then in the afternoon, late afternoon, go to someone else's house for dinner. Then go back to church, do that for a long time, and then go to someone else's house after church for dessert. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
Now, always the featured fare at meals was fried chicken.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Fried chicken. So my dad used to say that his belt was a leather fence around a chicken graveyard. He'd had a lot of chicken in his day. Well, one Sunday evening at an evening service, I was about 10. Everyone was singing and the Spirit was moving. And Miss Nellie was playing the organ. I apologize. I met someone this morning named Nellie, so this has nothing to do with you. I apologize for that. But her name really was Miss Nellie. She was playing the organ. And, we were just going along, and all of a sudden, Miss Nellie threw her hands up in the air, jumped straight up, started screaming and popping up and down. Well, everything stopped. We had no idea what was happening to Miss Nellie. So the pastor of that church, not my dad, but the pastor of that church was 80 years old, Brother Mullins. But that's what we called our pastors, you know, right? Brother Mullins. So he finally kind of got himself up and made his way over to the organ to see what was happening to Miss Nellie. And when he got over to the organ, he discovered that there was a rat running across the pedals of the organ. And so that is what had upset Miss Nellie. You see, we thought the spirit had a hold of Miss Nellie. Turned out it was just a rat. Just a rat. So, turns out that, interestingly enough, the story behind Amazing Grace has a bit of a rat in it too. The author of this hymn, John Newton, was quite a character, and the story that's been perpetuated about him is not entirely accurate, especially when it comes to how his writing Amazing Grace came about. Most of the time, the version of the story you will hear sounds like this. In his adult life, John Newton was a slave trader between Europe and Africa, and he captained the ships that held the slaves that were going to be sold. On one of the voyages of the slave ship, they ran into an incredible storm at night, one that really threatened the life of everyone on board. During that storm, John Newton said he begged God to get him home safely, and he reported that he truly experienced the grace of God in that moment. He promised God he would serve him if his life was spared. You ever done that? Bargained with God? I swear if you'll get me out of this, I'll give my life to you. Most tellings of this story suggest that Newton penned Amazing Grace on the ship that night in the middle of the storm.
Yeah, right.
But that is not how that happened at all. There's a little rat in this story, because the truth is, it was 20 years later before John Newton actually quit slave trading, became a pastor and abolitionist, and penned Amazing Grace. It didn't happen in that drama of a storm and him experiencing grace. He did experience God's grace in those life-threatening waters, but it took him 20 years to actually give that grace away. So, even though on some level this might seem like a disappointing story, the other one's much more dramatic, isn't it? There is something very important for us to learn about grace through this story of John Newton and the story that we just heard read from the Gospel of Luke. So, let's take a look at these two stories together. We have John Newton receiving grace in rough waters, and we have Jesus going to the synagogue where he'd been brought up. Now, it was his custom to frequently go to the synagogue, and when it was his time, the scripture said he stood up to read the scripture. They gave him the scroll of the book of Isaiah, and Jesus read these words, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because I have been anointed to bring good news to the poor, proclaim release of the captives, to give sight to the blind, and to let the oppressed go free." And then it says that he gave the scroll to the attendant, and he began to teach the people who were in the temple. And he told them in that moment, that day, it's like his coming out story. He told them, "I am the one. I'm the Messiah. I'm the great liberator, the one you've been waiting on all of this time. I am going to be the one who brings good news to the poor, lets the oppressed go free, gives sight to the blind. I'm that one." Now, if this happened today, and someone got up and said, "I'm the Messiah," we would chalk that up to mental illness. So here he is saying this stuff, right? Well, it turns out that the people in the synagogue were actually delighted to hear that the one they'd been waiting on, the great liberator, was here, and that this person, Jesus, was going to set them free. That meant a lot to the Jewish people, that he was going to set them free. But then something different happened. Jesus kept talking after they were so happy about it. And he said, "Wait a minute though. This liberation, this freedom that I've come to give, this grace that I've come to show you, is for everybody, not just you. This is for everyone with whom I will come in contact. This is for everyone, even the ones who are most unseemly, or we would say don't really deserve it. It's going to be for everyone. Now, many of us in this room have been on the receiving end of that kind of grace, haven't we? Because we've been given it, and then it's like, oh no, but not for you. We take it back. And Jesus was saying to them, oh no, you can't take it back. It's not just for you, it's for everyone. Well, the scripture says in these very words that once they heard Jesus say it was for everybody, the people in the synagogue were filled with rage. They weren't just a little angry. They were filled with rage. But I think there's a nugget there for us. There's a lesson there for us. It seems to me that the people listening to Jesus that day were simply observing grace. They were watching it, they were listening to it, and they had probably even been the recipients of it. But they had not allowed that grace to change them. I'd like to suggest that that may well be the difference between grace and amazing grace. Whether the grace you receive changes you. So think about it like this. If I find a diet that helps me to lose weight, may it be so. I want to give information to others who might find it helpful, right? But if I try out a diet that doesn't change me, I probably am not going to say much about it. Or if I read a book that changes my perspective about something, then I want to recommend that book to other people. But if I read a book and it basically has no effect on me, I still read the book, but I'm probably not going to recommend it to someone else. If I see a movie that moves me, I want to encourage others to see it. I'll run out and tell everybody, you really ought to go see that movie. But if I see it and I'm only mildly moved or interested, I probably won't encourage my friends to see it. So I think that maybe grace is the same way. Just because I receive it doesn't mean I have been changed by it. And unless I've been changed by it, I will not and cannot offer it to someone else. I'm awfully afraid that we have many times been guilty of making this grace thing all about us. I want it. We want it. We crave it. We need it. We want to feel it. Amen? Yep. But sometimes we don't want to be changed by it. John Newton apparently was like that. He wanted it. He experienced it that night in the storm, but it took him a long time for it to actually change him. Jesus' story indicates to me that the cycle of grace is not complete when I keep it all for myself. It cuts the cycle off. Jesus told his listeners that the grace he had received from God was grace he must now give away to even the most unseen, and even to those who did not deserve it. And by the way, I'm not sure any of us deserve grace. That's the beauty of grace. And right there in the safety of his home synagogue, the thought of giving grace to everyone filled people with rage. The people acted out their rage. You know, it's easy to miss this part of that story. They were so mad that they actually got Jesus, took him outside of town, and tried to throw him off a cliff. That's pretty mad. So then there's this gap in the story, I think. Because we go from they tried to push him off a cliff to he walked through them and went on his way. Now, I don't know what on earth transpired between people trying to throw him off the cliff and he walked through them and went on his way. But whatever that was, whatever enabled Jesus to stand up in the face of that rage, walk through the crowd, and move on to his ministry was powerful enough that those people were unable to harm him. Jesus went on his way to heal the sick and feed the poor right after people tried to push him off the cliff. That was the grace in which he stood. He went on his way to love the leper and to notice when the woman reached out and touched the hem of his garment. That was the grace in which he stood He went on his way to set the oppressed free and give healing to the sick. That was the grace in which he stood. And when he stood in that grace, it was no longer about him. It was about giving grace away. So, my friends, every person in this room, I'm sure, could testify to the grace that you've received from God at some point along the way, maybe many times along the way. But has it changed us enough that we can stand up and move on our way and give this grace away? Now, most of you are sitting out there going, yeah, that's good, preacher. But, you know, a lot of times it's only good until you try it on. And then it hurts a little bit. Then it gets harder, doesn't it? So I want you to practice a minute. I want you to listen and take this in. When we sit and listen to Jesus read the words of grace, grace extended to everyone, are we full of rage? Listen. When we hear Jesus extend grace to the homeless person who has no job, no money, no possessions, are we full of rage because they aren't pulling themselves up by their bootstraps and living the American dream? Or are we with Jesus in the grace in which he stood? When we hear Jesus extend grace to a prisoner who has raped and murdered a child, are we full of rage until they are put in the gas chamber to die for their sins? Or do we stand with Jesus, the grace in which he stood? When we hear Jesus extend grace to a young man who is illegally crossing the American border, are we full of rage at the nerve of people trying to survive? Or are we with Jesus, the grace in which he stood? When Jesus extends grace to a drug addict, are we full of rage at the woman who sells her body to feed her habit? Or are we with Jesus, the grace in which he stood? When Jesus extends grace to those who are arrogant and reckless with the lives of others, are we full of rage that there just seems to be no justice? Or are we with Jesus, the grace in which he stood? You see, that's harder, isn't it? That's harder. That list could go on and on. But no matter what makes up our list, the challenging lesson for us about grace is reflected in the name of the song we sung today, and we will sing again. There's grace. And then there's amazing grace. So what will it be for us? Will we simply say, grace is mine, keep it all to myself? Or will we turn to the one who would say to us today, amazing grace is when we turn me to we and mine to ours, all of ours. No one excluded. I hope today that amazing grace will truly be our song. So, Jeremiah's going to lead us in a different version of Amazing Grace. I understand that you all sing it around here some. You'll notice on the screen that there are some words that are bolded that have changed the song a little, because I want us to sing me to we and mine to ours. Please join us in the song.